Chapter 8. Dawn of the Cold War. Well, well, I see the issue of these arms. I cannot mend it. I must needs confess, because my power is weak, and all ill left. Shakespeare, King Richard II, 2.3, 151 to 153. As the big war was ending in Europe, the Cold War was beginning in Iran, and the Shah was faced with increasingly serious challenges to his rule. He was a virtual single parent, as his queen continued her long stay in Egypt, officially described by the court as a holiday. Two of his most tenacious adversaries were becoming the indispensable poles of Iranian politics, while the power and relevance of his allies were waning. A burgeoning nationalist movement threatened the status quo, while cells belonging to the rapidly spreading Communist Party continued to penetrate every part of the Iranian body politic, including the military. The Shah's precarious position and his tenuous hold on power in the early part of the 40s became most evident during the Tehran Conference in 1943. The meeting brought together leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. It was, in his words, his first brush with international diplomacy. He wrote, "Although I was technically the host of the conference, the Big Three paid me little notice. We were all after what the French called a quantite negligible. I was a king, barely 24 years old." The three big powers had decided to adopt the severest measure of secrecy and chose to tell the Shah about the meeting only at the last moment. Still more insulting for the Shah was the fact that neither Churchill nor Roosevelt bothered with internal protocol, and required they call on him, their host. Instead, they summoned the Shah to the embassies. The Shah's recollections of what transpired in these meetings changed as his sense of himself and his place in the world changed. In his 1980 Answer to History, written in exile when he felt betrayed and rejected, he called the meetings perfunctory and without real significance. In 1976, when he basked in the glory of his own accomplishments, and when he was constantly reminded of those he met of his genius for leadership and for matters military, his iteration of the meeting with Churchill was far from perfunctory. In 1976, the Shah claimed, with what he called justifiable pride, that he had essentially changed the course of the war by telling Churchill that the Allies should open the second front through the soft underbelly of Italy. According to the Shah, Churchill sat in thought, and a strange light came into his eyes. Of the three Allied leaders meeting in Tehran, only Stalin decided to bother with protocol and call on the Shah. It was an indication of the Shah's beleaguered state in 1943, and even the visit did not take place without embarrassing preconditions. The Soviets did not trust the guards around the Shah's palace and insisted on using Red Army soldiers to guard the building in the hours leading to the meeting. The Shah accepted the condition. On the day of the visit, he was nervous and excited. He anxiously moved about the court, making sure every detail was taken care of. "This is the most important meeting," he told his confidant, Hussein Fardast. Stalin began the meeting by reassuring the Shah that he should have no worry about the next 50 years, and advised him to keep a strong hold over his people. In recounting the conversation to the British ambassador, the Shah wondered whether this was Stalin's way of offering him a guarantee of power. The Shah was burning to talk to Stalin about Iran's need for planes and tanks. No sooner had the Shah raised his concern than Stalin offered a tank regiment and a squadron of planes with troops, training, and method of delivery to be discussed later. Was the gift too good to be true? 30 tanks and 30 airplanes, some fighters and some bombers were to be offered, along with a bevy of 250 Soviet experts, whose salaries the Soviet government offered to pay. The tank regiment would remain under the command of Russian officers and would be based in Kazvin, a 2-hour drive west of Tehran. It was, after all, rumors of movement by the Soviet army based in Kazvin that had led to Reza Shah's abdication and speedy departure from Tehran. The tanks and the rest of the gift were, in short, Stalin's Trojan horse, and the Shah had no desire to accept it. The British and American embassies encouraged him to reject the Soviet offer. He was also reminded by his advisers that the actual price of the Soviet gift was less than the economic loss Iran suffered every year it was forced to sell rice to the Red Army at an uneconomic price. Aside from his lifelong distrust of the Soviet intentions in Iran, there was an added reason for the Shah's refusal of the Russian offer. The Shah had come to believe that Stalin was the real victor in the Second World War, a view shared by some in the West who either believed Roosevelt was duped by Uncle Joe or accused him of betraying the fate of East and Central European nations by relegating them to the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. It was, the Shah believed, Stalin who pulled the strings at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, and he imposed a Soviet peace on the world that has now lasted for 35 years. Allowing a couple hundred Soviet advisors to roam around the country was for the Shah a recipe for disaster. In the months after the offer was made, the Shah's distrust of the Soviets only increased, putting him on the certain path of confrontation with Stalin. To some Western diplomats, the Shah's views on the Soviet Union around the time of the Second World War seemed unrealistic and alarmist. The views became particularly disturbing when the Shah held forth about the atom bomb and appeared to be immensely impressed with its military potential. Aware of America's post-Hiroshima nuclear monopoly, he advocated that the West should have used the monopoly to wage a preventative war against the Soviets. Once the Shah decided to reject Stalin's disingenuous gift, he tried to parlay it into some benefits for Iran. He told Sir Reeder Bullard, the British ambassador, that Stalin's call on him had made a very good impression on the Iranian public. They construed it as a sign of respect for Persian sovereignty. He then suggested that His Majesty's government must not allow themselves to be left behind, but should come forward with something equally striking. Bullard was both surprised and angered by the Shah's words and what they implied. He told the Shah that his was a preposterous suggestion and warned against the idea of trying to pit the Soviet Union against Britain. In another of his long litany of racist disparagements of the Persian character, Bullard concluded his report to the Foreign Office by saying, throughout the interview, the Shah showed how thoroughly Persian he is in character and how thin the veneer is he acquired in Switzerland. For Bullard, being Persian was synonymous with cowardice, duplicity, and depravity of character. Bullard's demeanor and disposition were so soundly insulting that on numerous occasions American envoys to Iran clashed with him. Eventually, the Shah informally requested that someone else replace Bullard as ambassador, something well within Iran's rights as a sovereign nation. The British government ignored the request. Even something as innocuous as giving a gift to the three visiting heads of state became a quandary for the Shah, a potential political minefield. The three leaders were allies at the time, but they were also competitors and were destined to soon become adversaries. It was crucial that none feel slighted. The Persian habit of hospitality and the culture's knack for survival, for bending with prevailing winds and waiting for the occasion to rise again, was handy in solving the gift quandary. The best living Iranian miniaturist was given the commission. He prepared 3 paintings that were exactly alike, save in one minor detail. Inspired by miniatures, depicted scenes from the Shahnameh, Iran's epic mythohistory. The gift paintings show 2 battling armies on horseback, swords and spears in hand. On one side are the Allies, obviously victorious and poised to deal the final blow to the retreating Axis forces. Emperor Hirohito, Mussolini, and Hitler are shown fleeing or fallen, pursued by the victorious Allied forces led by Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Behind a small hill in the far corner stand the people of Iran, watching but unmistakably disengaged from the raging battle. The only difference between the 3 paintings is that each head of state received a painting that showed him riding the white horse of victory and leading the other 2 Allied leaders in the charge against the defeated and retreating Nazis and their hapless Italian and Japanese allies. The miniature ploy solved the gift quandary, but the end of the war created for the Shah a far bigger challenge. The very idea of Iran as a multi-ethnic quilt faced an existential challenge. Such ethnic pluralism had hitherto been a source of richness for Iranian history. Now it threatened to become the country's Achilles heel. At the end of hostilities in Europe, the United States and Britain swiftly abided by their earlier pledges and withdrew their forces from Iran. Stalin had other plans, and the first hints of them came during the Potsdam Conference in July-August 1945. At that time, the Soviet Union announced its intention to keep its troops in Iran past the agreed date. 2 years earlier, in June 1943, unbeknownst to the Shah and the Iranian government, the Soviet Union had dispatched to Iran's northern provinces geologists disguised as military engineers. Their mission was to explore for gas and oil. They concluded that oil and gas reserves in Iran's northern provinces were not less than those controlled by the British in the south. Ever since the early years of the century, when Stalin was a sometime gangster, sometime revolutionary in the city of Baku, in Azerbaijan, he had known that the Caspian region was rich in oil. In fact, Baku was called at that time the greatest oil city in the world. It was in Baku that Stalin became, in the words of his brilliant biographer, Simon Sebag Montefiore, the godfather of a small but useful fundraising operation that really resembled a moderately successful mafia family, conducting shakedowns, currency counterfeiting. Half a century later, it was Iran's turn for a shakedown. But the riches of Iran's northern provinces surprised even Stalin. Soon after the receipt of the geologist's report on August 16, 1944, Stalin's infamous last chief of police, Lavrentiy Beria, sent him a telegram suggesting that the Soviet Union must set out vigorously to negotiate with Iran with the goal of obtaining a Soviet concession in northern Iran. In this effort, Beria could count on the support of the Soviet leaders running Soviet Azerbaijan, who had long been advocating plans to force Iran's northern provinces to join the Soviet Union and create what they imagined was the Greater Azerbaijan. With the war's end in sight and the Soviet Union's power and status increasingly recognized and feared around the world, the vast oil riches of Iran's northern provinces finally convinced Stalin to make his move. In a memorandum dated July 6, 1945, and signed by the Communist Party's Politburo, but believed to have been written by Stalin himself, the Communist Party of Soviet Azerbaijan was ordered to take all measures necessary to organize a separatist movement in southern Azerbaijan and other provinces of northern Iran. Stalin ordered the creation of a national autonomous Azerbaijan with broad powers within the Iranian state, as well as work among the Kurds of northern Iran to draw them into the separatist movement, a form of national autonomous Kurdish district. The leader of the Tuda party, Samad Kambakash, was summoned to Baku, where he was ordered to dissolve the Tuda party apparatus in Azerbaijan and meld its members into the new organization. The Tuda branch in the city of Tabriz, the capital of Azerbaijan, had only been created in 1942, and 4 of its 5 founding members had spent some time in the Soviet Union in the decade before the war. Some Tuda leaders, driven more by their genuine nationalist sentiments, had by the servile internationalist spirit favored by Stalin, objected to the Soviet policy. They wrote a surprisingly harshly worded letter to Soviet leaders, but their effort was of no consequence. It was, after all, an article of faith and part of the bylaws of the Third International of Communist Parties, Comintern, in brackets, created by Lenin and Stalin after October 1917, that was the interest of the Soviet Union as the bastion of the proletarian revolution, always took precedence over the parochial interest of any communist party that joined the organization. Stalin's directive even offered detailed guidance on the number of publications. The separatist movement in Iran should have an illustrated magazine published in Baku for distribution in Iran, and also 3 new newspapers on southern Azerbaijan, as well as the policies it should follow, land reform, and radical movements in Soviet-Iran relations, amongst others. Stalin ended by allocating a special fund of 1 million foreign currency rubles for conversion into tumans, to defray some of the movement's costs. Less than 2 months after the Moscow Directive, in August 1945, sympathizers of a newly launched movement took over government buildings in the city of Tabriz and issued a manifesto. The continued Soviet occupation of Iran and the creation of a separatist movement in Azerbaijan, and before long also in the Iranian region of Kurdistan, led to the first major political crisis in the Shah's reign. In December 1944, Dr. Mossadegh, who had easily won a seat in the Majlis, shepherded through the parliament a bill prohibiting the Iranian government from negotiating about or granting any new oil concessions during the war. In arguing for the virtues of his proposed new bill, Mossadegh articulated the essential elements of the philosophy for Iran's foreign policy. It came to be known as Movazenye Manfi, negative balance. He criticized the idea of positive balance, propagated at the time by both the Soviet Union and Britain. It advocated a concession for the Soviets to balance the British concession. If Iran does so, Mossadegh said, her action would resemble that of a person with one hand amputated who, in pursuance of balance, would consent to have his right hand amputated. By the time Mossadegh introduced his bill, the Soviet Union had already begun pressuring Iran for oil concessions in the north. Their first mission demanding such a deal had arrived in Tehran in September 1944. Their demand was based not just on what they had found in Iran, but what Iran had given to the British, but also the incredible idea that without concessions in Iran's northern provinces, the Baku oil fields would be threatened. Stalin told an American diplomat that saboteurs, even a person with only one box of matches, could risk our oil resource. The Russians were not only ones seeking a new concession in Iran, but by then American-owned companies like Standard Vacuum and Sinclair Oil, and European concerns like the Shell Oil Company were also looking for oil concessions in Iran. The Shah had also let it be known that he favored more Americans' oil concerns at the time. As these companies competed for a deal with Iran, the Tudeh party also began to unabashedly defend Russia's legitimate interest in Iran's northern provinces. Worried that the Tudeh party members in the Majlis, not incidentally near all elected in the Soviet-occupied territories, would filibuster this bill. Mossadegh maintained complete secrecy about his intentions, and the Tudeh deputies were apparently taken completely by surprise when the bill was introduced. The Shah called Mossadegh to the court in 1944, around the time of the bill's passage, and offered the surprised deputy the job of prime minister. Much to the Shah's surprise, and to his perpetual derision afterwards, Mossadegh predicated his acceptance of the prime minister's job on the prior approval of the British government. For the Shah, the condition was a sign of Mossadegh's cowardice or political chicanery, or even an indication that he was working in collusion with the British government. According to Mossadegh, he refused the offer first because he did not think the Shah had the constitutional authority to appoint a prime minister. The job of the king, Mossadegh wrote, was far more of a figurehead. The argument made while Mossadegh was in jail and long after the time the offer was made seems inconsistent and concocted after the fact. In reality, in his meeting, Mossadegh told the same figurehead, Shah, that should the British agree with the appointment, he would accept the offer. Mossadegh further added that he knew full well the power of the British in Iran. At the time, they were occupying half of the country. Moreover, Mossadegh wrote that he knew of the British opposition to his politics and personality, and thus knew the appointment would never materialize. As it turned out, Mossadegh was right on this point. When the Shah raised with Bullard the issue of the offer he had made to Mossadegh, the ambassador was incensed and tried, in his own words, to deprecate the idea by telling the Shah that such an appointment would be a departure from the constitution. Of course, at other times, this same Bullard had no compunction asking, even demanding, that the Shah fire one prime minister or appoint another. So concerned was the British government about the possibility of Mossadegh appointment that Bullard was instructed to meet with the Shah after and draw his attention to the effect such unconstitutional action might be expected to have on public opinion abroad, to which he is sensitive. In case even the warning did not work, Bullard was instructed to remind the Shah about the danger of following in his father's footsteps. In 1944, the father's footsteps had led him to a lonely house in Johannesburg, where he was a virtual prisoner of the British. A couple of days after the meeting, the Shah called Mossadegh to call him other to call excuse me. In case even this warning did not work, Bullard was instructed to remind the Shah about the danger of following in his father's footsteps. In 1944, the father's footsteps had led him to a lonely house in Johannesburg, where he was a virtual prisoner of the British. A couple of days after the meeting, the Shah called Mossadegh to tell him about British opposition to the idea. In the meantime, as the Azerbaijan crisis continued, the Soviet Union made it clear that they would not negotiate with any prime minister other than the Khavim. They particularly ruled out and then sitting prime minister Ibrahim Hakimi. By the end of the war, the Soviets had up to 60,000 soldiers in Iran, and the vast territories they occupied included Kazvin, a mere 2-hour drive from Tehran. About this time, Khavim decided to try his hand in politics yet again. On June 4, 1945, he sent Javad Amiri to the British Embassy to sound the ambassador out about Khavim as a candidate for the Prime Minister. The embassy was less than enthusiastic. While it would be difficult to work with Khavim, they said they were also no longer opposed to such an appointment. The British knew that the Shah would be opposed to Khavim's premiership. 2 years earlier, the same embassy had all but concluded that the Shah had conspired with the military to topple Khavim during his earlier turn at the helm. Moreover, as late as January 24, 1944, the British ambassador had informed the Shah that H.M. Legation no longer considers Khavim a suitable candidate for the post of Prime Minister. At that time, Bullard had shown the Shah a note drawn up by the British Secretary Authority and based on good evidence showing that Khavim had least connived at fifth column activities with the Nazis when he was Prime Minister. But much to the Shah's surprise, the British were now in favor of Khavim's premiership. The British wanted Iran's problems with the Soviet Union resolved lest the issue jeopardize their own monopoly of the southern region's oil, and Khavim was, in their view, the only man capable of bringing about such a resolution. The American embassy, too, had all along shown a favorable disposition towards Khavim, while the Soviets were all but demanding Khavim's appointment as Prime Minister. During those months, the Shah had two things on his mind: an over-ambitious Prime Minister like Khavim and what Great Britain might have in store for Iran. He was worried that Khavim might be planning to appease Stalin as a first step towards overthrowing the monarchy. He was also anxious that the continued impasse between the Soviet Union and the West would tempt the British to make a secret deal with the Soviets and bargain away Iran's independence or territorial integrity. So worried was the Shah about this possibility that on January 28, 1945, in a 2.5 hour meeting with the British ambassador, he threw his customary caution to the wind and asked Bullard point blank, "Do you think there is any possibility that the British government might give Persia up and fall back on a division of the country, for example, on the 1907 model, when Tsarist Russia and Britain divided Iran in half, each claiming a part as their virtual protectorate?" Bullard's response was less than reassuring. On the one hand, he said absolutely no to the possibility of Britain's participating in a new partition of Iran. But then he went on to say that the only situation which could conceivably bring about the physical partition of Persia would be one which necessitates our armed intervention to protect our oil interests. The Shah's fears were initially the result of some unusual moves the British had been making those days. These fears were confirmed during the Yalta Conference in February 1945. For example, when the British Foreign Secretary told the Soviet counterpart that it was not part of the British policy to prevent Soviet Union obtaining oil in northern Iran, adding that in Britain's view, Russians were a natural consumer for Iranian oil. Once the Soviets made their push for just such a concession, the Shah realized that the British were toying with what was initially called the Bevan Plan, giving the North to the Soviets and keeping the South and its oil-rich Khuzestan province for themselves. According to the Shah, in anticipating such a prospect, the British had gone so far as to unite the varieties of tribes of the South into a federation, and resume their ties to the Khazar family, which had once run that region as a virtual British protectorate. In addition, British troops in the Iraqi city of Basra had been reinforced and 2 warships were sent to Abadan. Britain's expressed hope that Russia would obtain the petroleum rights in the north was based on the calculation that such a concession would make British rights in the south safer. They assumed that no future Iranian government would dare take on both the Russian and British governments and nationalize the country's oil. Another key component of the British policy had been to dissuade Iran from filing a complaint against the Soviet Union in the UN Secretary Council, the first complaint ever filed with the newly created international body. For his part, the Shah made every effort to keep the push forward, Iran's complaint on the Security Council agenda. British policy paralleled the Soviet point of view and insisted on the idea that the Azerbaijan question was a domestic Iranian issue and therefore no concern of the United Nations. At one time, the British ambassador marched into the offices of Ibrahim Hakimi, Iran's prime minister, with British tanks standing outside, and dictated a letter to Iran's representatives to the UN demanding that they withdraw Iran's complaint against the Soviet Union. Lest Hakimi get cold feet, Bullard insisted on using the British military's secure lines to send the coerced telegram. As it happened, Hussein Allah, Iran's ambassador to the UN and the United States at the time, buoyed by words of support from American officials and from some of his colleagues, decided to ignore the telegram, or more accurately, he decided to pretend it had arrived too late and he proceeded with the complaint. So worried was the Shah about these British machinations that, as a gesture of displeasure, he refused to meet with the British ambassador for a short while in 1946. A few months earlier, in an attempt to force Britain's hand and abort the possibility of an Anglo-Soviet collusion, the Shah had toyed with the idea of ordering Iran's military forces into Soviet-occupied Kurdistan without seeking Russian permission. This would, he hoped, create an incident and pit the British and American forces against the Soviet Union. The United States diffused the situation by convincing the Shah to seek Soviet permission, but the sense of distrust continued to fester. The Shah's anxieties about Kazim were also not baseless. Fully aware of Kazim's past ambitions, the Shah was now faced with the reality that the three big powers, which had once either reviled or at least distrusted Kazim, were suddenly all enamored of him. Eventually, the Shah had no choice but to succumb to these pressures, and he appointed Kazim prime minister on January 26, 1946. For decades after the end of the war, Kazim and his supporters cultivated the myth that only his cunning, nationalism, and political acumen had saved Iran's territorial integrity and fooled Stalin into pulling Soviet troops out of Iran. Archival evidence does not support this claim.